The final piece to build for the frost attack is the frost cone. The frost cone is going to be our visual indicator of what the actual range and angle of this frost attack is. The particle effect for it is going to be a relative torrent of icy bits flying towards the enemies. To start creating this, I'm going to go ahead and create a new particle system. And I'm going to rename this Frost Cone. The properties for the Frost Cone are all going to be geared towards making it look really fast and very thick, full of ice. Let's change the duration to be 0.5, and we'll leave looping and play on awake turned on. Also, our start lifetime is only going to be 1. However, our start speed is going to be very high, somewhere around 48. I'm also going to reduce the size to 0.2. For the rotation, I'm going to make it a random between two constants, giving it values of negative 180 to 180. I'm also going to change the simulation space to world and change its scaling mode to shape. Now before I continue, I'm going to go down to the renderer and change its rendering settings. I'm going to go ahead and click the circle selector next to the material property, and I'm going to choose Dusty Cloud Additive. Now I can see my particles are projecting straight up and down. So let's go ahead and fix this. I'm going to go ahead and give this a rotation of 90 about the x-axis, but I'm also going to give it a rotation of negative 60 about the y-axis. The reason for the negative 60 degree rotation about the y-axis is because I'm going to want the cone to project between the y and x axes. So if we look at the y and x axes, currently being the axes that point left and right on the screen, we want the cone to emit right between those. I'm going to go to the emissions module, and I'm going to change the rate from 10 to 100. Then I'm going to go to the shape module and change it from a cone to a circle. Now I don't want this circle to emit in all 360 degrees. Instead, I want the circle to emit in a radius of 2.5 and an arc of only 60 degrees. Now we can see particles emit between the two axes. Granted, they don't emit completely between the y and x axes because those axes represent an angle of 90 degrees. However, our cone, as in our mesh collider, the arc, is only 60 degrees. Next, to get these to group up, I'm going to add a limit velocity over lifetime module. I'm going to change the speed to 2.4, which lets it go a bit faster. And I don't want to dampen it by 1 or 100%. Instead, I'm going to dampen it by a smaller value, 0.14. Now we can see the particles pool up at the very edge of the arc. Now I'd like these to be a bluer color, so I'm going to go ahead and add a color over lifetime module. I'm going to change the gradient of the color over lifetime module to go from white to a blue color. It's also going to fade from full opacity to 0 opacity at the very end. To make these particles more apparent and look more like a torrent of ice, I'm also going to add a size over lifetime module. The curve for this size over lifetime module is going to go from 0 to 15. So I'm going to change the value to 15 at the upper bound. Then our particle is going to start just below 5 for their size. Quickly, they're going to go to just above 10. And then they're going to steadily grow until they get to 15. Let's go ahead and make that ice a little bit more blue. So I'm going to go back to the color over lifetime module, and I'm going to bring the blue color closer to the beginning there. It's also a bit too blue, so I'm going to go ahead and maybe just reduce it down a slight bit. There we go. Now I'd like to give these individual particles some additional rotation over their lifetime. I'm going to change this to be a random between two constants. and I'm going to give it the values of -45 to 90. We now have our initial torrent of frost. The next part I'm going to do is I'm going to add the ice bits to it. I'm going to do that by clicking the plus icon right next to our frost cone particle system in the particle effects window. I'm going to rename this new particle system Ice Bits. Now the Ice Bits particle system has a lot in common with the frost cone particle system, so I'm going to go ahead and copy it. I'll click on the frost cone game object, right click on its particle system and select copy component. Then I'll go down to Ice Bits and again right click on the particle system and select paste component values. We'll notice that the particle effect window doesn't immediately update, so all I need to do is click away from Ice Bits and click back, and I'll see all of the modules appear. Now to change some of these values, first off, the start lifetime is now only going to be 0.75. We'll leave the very high start speed, and we'll also leave the size. We're going to remove the start rotation difference, so we'll go back to a constant, and we'll set it to 0. I'm going to go down to the renderer next, just so we can set up our material. I'm going to change that from the dusty cloud to Ice Bits. Because Ice Bits is a texture sheet, I'm going to go ahead and add the texture sheet animation module. We know that Ice Bits has 1 column and 4 rows, so I'll dial those values in now. Now we don't want our Ice Bits to actually animate, so I'm going to go ahead and choose single row with a random row chosen. This is basically the same particle material we used for the Frost Debuff prefab. However, as we remember, the Frost Debuff prefab was more roundish, more even in its length and width. We want this to really seem stretched out, like it's protruding forward. So I'm going to go back to my render settings, and I'm going to change the render mode from a simple billboard to a stretched billboard. Then I'm going to change the length scale from 2 to 3.13. Now we can see the ice really flying forward. Going back up to my other modules, I'm going to leave emission at 100. I'm going to leave shape as my circle with all of those properties. But I'm going to go to my limit velocity over lifetime. Now I'm going to leave my speed the same, but I'm going to reduce the dampening value even further, this time to 0.08. I'm going to leave the color over lifetime alone, and for the size over lifetime, I'm going to make a modification. I'm still going to go between 0 and 15. However, I'd really like the ice to gradually appear and have some fluctuation. Therefore, I'm going to take the initial keyframe and move it much closer to 0. I'm going to take the second keyframe and move it more towards the upper right hand corner. I'm going to right click on this keyframe and choose Broken, which is going to allow me to add a bit of a bump on one side and also on the other. That's going to add a little bit of fluctuation to the way this particle grows. Let me straighten that part out right there. We now have our initial frost cone and our ice bits. If I look at my VFX reference prefabs folder and then look at the frost cone inside, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag one into my scene to see a reference of it. With this in my scene, I'm going to expand it and notice that there's one more particle system, the freeze cone inner. For the sake of time, we're not going to cover the freeze cone inner in this video. However, just know that it's very similar to the frost cone parent we just created. We're going to leave the creation of the freeze cone inner up to you. Go ahead and attempt to see if you can make it based on the reference prefab. Remember, if you get stuck, you can always go through the reference prefab and see exactly how it was built. Or, if you'd like, you can just use the prefab that's in the VFX reference prefabs folder. Once you're done with your frost cone, you can go ahead and click and drag it down into the prefabs folder, specifically the VFX subfolder, in the project window, saving it as a prefab.